The station had a smell before it had a name. Recycled air run through filters older than most of the crew, a faint tang of ozone from the docking clamps. And beneath all of it, the mineral coldness of a hull that had been breathing the same 1,000 cubic kilometers of vacuum for 11 years. Grail Station sat at the seam of 3 trade lanes, a waypoint built by nobody in particular and claimed by everybody who mattered. It had 41 docking rings, 6 atmospheres blended into one, and a maintenance corridor on Deck 9 that nobody with rank ever bothered to walk. That corridor had a floor. The floor had a color once, blue-gray composite tile, though 11 years of boots had worn it down to something closer to the color of old rain. Every morning at the same hour, marked by a chime no one outside Deck 9 ever heard, a man went down that corridor with a cart and a mop and did the thing that nobody watched him do. His name was Elias Voss. He was 51 years old, though his hands looked older, the knuckles thickened from a lifetime of gripping things that other people considered beneath them. He was not tall, he was not broad. He wore a gray coverall with a patch on the shoulder that had faded past legibility, and he moved through the station the way water moves through a pipe that has carried the same water for a long time, without hurry, without complaint, without anyone noticing until it stopped. He did not speak much. When he did, the sentence was short. The Vectari arrived on the station in numbers that week, 7 of them off a diplomatic cutter with hull plating polished to a mirror shine, come to finalize a trade concession that would move 400,000 tons of refined ore through Grail's rings every quarter for the next decade. They were tall in the way that made low ceilings feel like an insult directed at them personally, and they wore ceremonial collars stacked with rank insignia that caught the light every time they turned their heads, which was often because turning their heads to look down at things was a gesture they had perfected. Their delegation leader was named Thal Corvexis Wren, third of that name in his line, and he had the kind of voice that made administrative announcements sound like a favor being granted. He believed, with the calm certainty of a species that had never lost a war it started, that human beings occupied a rung on the galactic ladder somewhere between decorative and disposable. He was not alone in this. Most of the crew on Grail Station, human and otherwise, had learned to route around that belief the way one routes around a support column bolted into the floor. They didn't argue with it, they just walked past it. On the 3rd day of the delegation's stay, Thal Corvexis Wren was walking the observation ring with 2 of his aides when he encountered a man with a mop. Elias was working the corner by viewport 7, the one that looked out over the ore lane, methodically pushing gray water across tile that did not particularly need it, because that was the hour the schedule gave him, and Elias did not deviate from the schedule. He did not look up as the 3 Vectari approached. This, more than anything, was the offense. "You," Thal said, and stopped walking, which made his aides stop walking, which made the whole corridor still. "Move your equipment. We require the space." Elias glanced at the cart, then at the 8 meters of clear corridor to either side of it, then back to his mop. "There's room," he said. It was the wrong answer, or the right one, depending entirely on where one was standing when one heard it. Thal's collar caught the light as he turned his head fully toward the man for the first time, taking him in. The gray coverall, the faded patch, the flat, unbothered posture of someone who had absorbed 1,000 versions of this moment before, and never once let it show on his face. "I did not ask for your assessment of the room," Thal said. "I gave you an instruction." What happened next took 4 seconds, and every account of it afterward described those 4 seconds differently, because 4 seconds is long enough for perception to become opinion. Thal's hand came down on the handle of the mop, meaning to simply move it, the way one might move an object that had failed to move itself. Elias's hand was already there, not gripping hard, not resisting with any visible strain, just present, unmoved, a small anchor of bone and callus against Thal's much larger, much stronger hand. The mop did not move. Thal pushed harder. Aides watched. Somewhere down the corridor, a woman named Priya Okonkwo Reyes, station logistics clerk, third shift, 26 years old, had stopped walking with a tablet in her hand and was watching with the particular stillness of someone who senses that she is about to witness something she will describe to people for the rest of her life. The mop still did not move. "Move," Thal said, and for the first time there was something under the polish of his voice, a thin wire of something that was not quite anger and was not quite confusion, but lived somewhere in the country between them. Elias looked up at him then, for the first time, and his eyes were the color of the corridor floor, worn flat by long use. "No," he said. Nothing else. No raised voice, no lecture. The single flat syllable landed in the corridor and sat there. And Thal Corvexus Wren, delegate of a species that had annexed 11 systems without losing a fleet action in 3 centuries, discovered that he did not know what to do with a man who would not move a mop. He shoved him. It was not a calculated blow. It was the reflex of a body accustomed to being obeyed, meeting an obstacle that declined to obey, and resolving the confusion through force because force had never previously failed him. His hand caught Elias in the chest and drove him backward into the cart, which tipped, spilling gray water across the worn blue-gray tile in a long, dark comet tail. Elias did not fall. He caught the edge of the cart with one hand, absorbed the shove with a small give in his knees, and straightened. He did not shove back. He set the cart upright. He looked at the water on the floor, and then at Thal, and he said 4 words that Priya Okonkwo Reyes would repeat to a debrief officer 11 hours later, with her hands still faintly shaking. "You'll want to leave." It was not a threat in the shape threats usually take. There was no volume in it, no promise of retaliation, nothing that gave Thal Corvexus Wren an obvious posture to escalate against. It was delivered the way a man might mention that it was about to rain. A statement of fact about the near future, offered without malice by someone who seemed almost sorry to be the one saying it. Thal laughed. It was not a warm sound. "Leave," he repeated, tasting the word like it was a joke told badly. "You clean floors on a station my government is one signature away from owning a controlling interest in. You will address me with the honorific due my rank, or I will have you removed from this facility within the hour." Elias picked up his mop. "Okay," he said, and went back to work. The delegation moved on. The aides were laughing before they turned the corner, already composing the story they would tell over dinner, the one about the little gray creature who cleaned floors and thought he had the standing to refuse a Vectari of the Wren line. It was, by any account available to them in that moment, a very small thing, a janitor, a mop, a shove that had barely required effort. Priya did not laugh. She walked to the nearest wall panel and put in a call to her supervisor. And when her supervisor did not answer fast enough, she called someone else. And that call went up a chain that most people on Grail Station did not know existed, through channels with names like Routine Variance and Personnel Flag, until it landed, 40 minutes later, on a secure terminal 3 decks up, in an office with no nameplate on the door, where a woman named Halverson read the transcript twice and picked up a different phone entirely. "He's been made," she said when the call connected. "Vectari delegation, physical contact, witnesses, deck 9. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of pause that comes from someone doing arithmetic they had hoped not to need to do for another 11 years. "Copy," said the voice on the other end. "Start the clock." To understand what that clock meant requires going back. Not far in distance, the same station, the same corridors, but a long way in time, to a period before Grail Station had 41 docking rings, before the trade lanes converged there, before anyone called it a waypoint that mattered. 11 years earlier, Grail Station had been a half-built skeleton of a thing. 6 atmospheres not yet blended, most of its decks still open to vacuum behind temporary seals. It had been built, ostensibly, as a neutral commercial platform, funded by consortium credits and staffed by a rotating cast of contractors from a dozen species who had no particular loyalty to it or to each other. It had also been built, though almost no one alive knew this, as something else entirely. The woman who knew was named Colonel Renata Ashworth Kim, and at the time she had held a rank that did not appear on any personnel roster accessible to the consortium, working for a division of Earth's Joint Intelligence Directorate so quiet that even its existence was classified above the level most ministers were cleared to read. She had walked the unfinished corridors of Grail Station with a tablet and a small, unhurried certainty, and she had made a series of decisions that, individually, looked like nothing. She authorized the installation of maintenance conduits 11 centimeters wider than structural requirement demanded. She approved staffing requests for Deck 9 janitorial rotation with unusual persistence, 3 separate times, over 3 separate budget cycles, when other departments would have simply let the position go unfilled. She signed off on a decade-long service contract for a single maintenance contractor, human, mid-30s at the time, whose file noted prior military service in a conflict zone that no longer existed under that name, and whose subsequent employment history was, on paper, unremarkable. She wrote in a document that would not be declassified for another 6 years past the events on Grail Station, a single line that her successor would later find and read 3 times before understanding it. Patience is not the absence of a plan. It is the plan worn as a disguise. The plan in its bones was simple enough to say in one sentence and complicated enough to take 11 years to build. Grail Station's maintenance systems, the conduits, the recyclers, the deep structural crawl spaces that no consortium engineer had ever bothered to fully map, because the man responsible for keeping them clean had quietly become the only person alive who understood their true architecture, had been built to also be something a hostile power would never think to look for inside a mop closet. Elias Voss had spent 11 years pushing a cart through Deck 9. He had also spent 11 years threading fiber conduits through 11 centimeters of extra clearance that nobody remembered authorizing, installing sensor nodes disguised as junction housings, running diagnostic checks disguised as routine maintenance, and building, one unremarkable shift at a time, a nervous system for the station that answered to exactly one authority and reported to exactly one office, light years away, that most of the people currently walking Grail's corridors did not know existed. He had been chosen for the posting not because he had once been a soldier, though he had, but because of something else in his file, a single evaluator's note that Ashworth Kim had circled twice before signing his assignment orders. Subject demonstrates unusual capacity to be underestimated. Recommend long-term placement requiring sustained invisibility. He was good at being overlooked. It was, in its way, the rarest skill the directorate had ever needed, and Elias Voss had it the way some people have perfect pitch. Not learned exactly, just there, waiting to be used. He had not chosen the corridor. He had built it into something worth choosing. Back on Deck 9, in the present, in the 4 hours after the shove, Elias finished his shift on schedule. He mopped the last section of corridor. He emptied the cart into the recycler chute. He walked back to his quarters, a small, spare room with a narrow bunk, one framed photograph on the shelf of a woman and a young boy standing in front of a house that did not exist anymore, and nothing else that told anyone anything about who lived there. He sat on the edge of the bunk for a while. He did not turn on the light. 11 years was a long time to wait for a shove. He had known, in the abstract, that it would come eventually, that a delegation confident enough would eventually treat the invisible man in the gray coverall the way invisible men in gray coveralls are so often treated, and that when it did, the clock Halverson had spoken of on the phone would finally start. He had rehearsed none of it and expected all of it. What he had not expected, if he was honest with the quiet of the room, was how tired it would make him feel to finally hear the words, "You'll want to leave," come out of his own mouth. 11 years of silence built the sentence. 4 seconds spent it. He picked up the photograph, looked at it for a moment, and set it back down exactly where it had been. Then he opened a panel behind the shelf that was not supposed to be there and began. The Vectari cutter's arrival had been logged, cross-checked, and cataloged the moment it docked, 3 days prior, by systems that reported to Elias and to no one aboard the cutter itself. Its registry, its manifest, the true cargo hidden beneath the declared one, 41 kilotons of refined ore concession, was the story. Underneath it, buried in encrypted subledgers that the Vectari Trade Ministry believed no outside party could ever access, was a second agenda involving weapons-grade isotopes routed through 3 shell consortiums and destined for a staging fleet massed 2 jumps away in a system that had not yet made the evening news on any human world. Grail Station's negotiators, the actual credentialed diplomatic staff who believed themselves to be running this engagement, had no idea. They had been negotiating an ore contract in good faith, unaware that the ore contract was cover, unaware that the delegation's true purpose was to establish a forward logistics foothold from which a war could be quietly supplied without ever being declared. Elias had known for 6 weeks. He had spent those 6 weeks doing what he always did, nothing visible, watching, cataloging, waiting for the delegation to give someone, anyone, a reason. Thal Corvexus Wren had given several. He simply hadn't known he was doing it in front of the one person on the station who was keeping score. At 0300 station time, while most of Deck 6 slept, and the Vectari delegation's quarters ran quiet behind locked doors, the station's systems began a sequence that no log would show as anomalous, because Elias had built the systems, and the systems did not know how to lie to him. Docking clamp telemetry for the Vectari cutter reported nominal status to the cutter's own bridge, while a parallel, invisible channel fed Halverson's office 3 decks up, a live feed of every valve, every fuel line, every weapons interlock aboard the vessel. A logistics subledger, the one the Vectari believed encrypted beyond any outside reach, unspooled itself byte by byte into a directorate archive that would, within the week, be sitting on the desks of 11 different intelligence services across human and allied space. None of it announced itself. That was the entire design. The plan Ashworth Kim had authored 11 years earlier had never been about a dramatic strike. It had been about becoming, patiently and invisibly, the nervous system of a place someone else believed they controlled, and then simply being there, already inside, the moment they gave it a reason to act. Thal Corvexus Wren had given the reason in 4 seconds in a maintenance quarter. He would not learn what that had cost him until the following morning. At 0600, the delegation's cutter attempted a standard pre-departure systems check, a formality before the day's negotiation session. Every readout came back green. Every readout was a lie, curated in real time by a system that had learned, over 11 years, exactly what green was supposed to look like. At 0610, Thal Corvexus Wren received a priority communication from his government's trade ministry that made him set down his cup with a hand that was not quite steady. The 11 shell consortiums routing the weapons-grade isotope shipment had been simultaneously frozen. Not investigated, not flagged for review, frozen, all 11, in the same 9-minute window by regulatory bodies across 4 separate jurisdictions that, as far as the Vectari Trade Ministry's own intelligence apparatus could determine, had no reason to be coordinating with each other at all. Somewhere on a fleet staging ground 2 jumps away, a logistics officer named Vask Orental, junior grade, 26 years into a career that had never asked him to think very hard about the ships he supplied, opened his morning manifest and found half of it grayed out, canceled, unrecoverable. He stared at the screen for a long moment. "That's not possible," he said to no one, because no one else was in the room yet. He would say those same 3 words 4 more times before the day was finished, in 4 different contexts, with decreasing confidence each time. By 0700, the story had reached the wider Vectari administrative apparatus, in the fractured, half-formed way that bad news always travels first. Not as a briefing, but as a rumor moving faster than the confirmation behind it. An analyst named Sorel Doth Carnavine, 41 years in service, the kind of career functionary who had read 10,000 intelligence reports and trusted almost none of them at first glance, pulled the raw feed herself rather than wait for a summary. She found something that made her stop scrolling and go back to the beginning. The freezes weren't reactive. That was the detail that unsettled her most. More than the scale of it, more than the coordination. Reactive freezes had a signature, a triggering event, then a scramble, then a slightly ragged response as different jurisdictions caught up to each other at different speeds. This had no ragged edge. It had the smoothness of something that had been sitting ready, fully assembled for a very long time, waiting only for a single authorization to release. She pulled the historical access logs for the Shell Consortium's regulatory files, the ones that should have shown, if this had been reactive, a burst of frantic queries in the preceding hours. Instead, she found something stranger, low, steady, occasional access going back years, files quietly reviewed, updated, watched, at intervals so unremarkable that no automated flag had ever caught them. Someone had been reading this ledger for a very long time. Someone had simply never done anything with what they read, until now. "They've had this the whole time," she said quietly, to the empty analysis bay, and felt something cold settle into her chest that she did not have a word for yet, though by the end of the week, most of her colleagues would. The station's negotiators, the human ones, the actual credentialed diplomats who had spent 3 days believing they were haggling over an ore concession, learned what had happened roughly the same way everyone else did, from the outside in, piece by piece, with growing disbelief. Ambassador Corinne Delacroix Whitmore had been running point on the human side of the ore talks, a career diplomat with 22 years of trade negotiation behind her and absolutely no security clearance for anything Elias Voss had spent a decade building beneath her feet. At 0830, she was summoned to a secure briefing room she did not know existed on a station she had believed she understood, and found Halverson waiting for her with a tablet and an expression that gave away nothing. "I need you to sit down," Halverson said. "I'm standing," Delacroix Whitmore said. "What's happening to my negotiation?" "Your negotiation was a cover story," Halverson said. "It has been for 3 days. It was always going to end sometime in the next 72 hours, regardless of what you did in that room. And it ended this morning at 0610 for reasons that have nothing to do with ore." Delacroix Whitmore did sit down then, mostly because her legs made the decision before the rest of her did. "Who authorized this?" she said. "This station, whatever this is." Halverson slid the tablet across the table. On it was a single document, 11 years old, signed by a name Delacroix Whitmore did not recognize, authorizing a decade-long maintenance services contract for a Deck 9 janitorial position. "Him," Halverson said. "The janitor," Delacroix Whitmore said, very slowly, the way one says a sentence one doesn't yet believe out of one's own mouth. "The man they shoved. The man who built this station's spine while cleaning its floors," Halverson said. "Yes." By midday, the story had stopped being contained in the way any true story eventually stops being contained. It moved off the station through the ordinary channels that carry all news, distorted a little at each hop, arriving in newsrooms, in briefing rooms, light years apart within hours of each other. Each outlet reaching for a version of the truth simple enough to say out loud. A financial correspondent for a mid-tier consortium broadcast, a woman named Aditi Fernwright, who had covered ore concessions for 6 years without once expecting them to be interesting, found herself instead narrating a story about frozen shell companies, a weapons shipment that never left dock, in a delegation that had, by all early accounts, walked into an ambush it never saw being built, because the ambush had been built out of a decade of mop floors. "We are still confirming details," she said to the camera, in the flat, professional register of someone trying not to let her own astonishment leak into her voice. But multiple sources within Grail Station's administrative apparatus now describe what happened this morning not as an intelligence operation in the traditional sense, but as something closer to, and I want to be careful here, the activation of an asset that had simply been waiting for 11 years. Old intelligence analysts, the kind who kept their own private files long after retirement out of habit rather than authorization, began pulling records they hadn't looked at in years. A retired directorate cryptanalyst named Marcus Oyalaran, 73, living quietly on a coastal settlement on a world 3 jumps from Earth, received a message from a former colleague that simply read, "Check the Grail file, you'll want to see this," and spent the following 6 hours at his kitchen table reading through documents he had once helped classify, watching a decade-old plan he barely remembered signing off on, finally pay out. "Ashworth Kim," he said aloud to his empty kitchen, and laughed once, short and surprised, the laugh of a man remembering an old friend's stubbornness fondly. "You patient old devil." Ordinary people, the ones with no clearance and no stake beyond curiosity, felt the change the way people always feel these things, not through the details, most of which never reached them, but through a shift in the tone of the rooms they occupied. A bartender on a station 4 jumps from Grail noticed that a table of Vectari traders who came in twice a week had gone quiet, hunched over drinks they weren't finishing, speaking in low voices with the particular carefulness of people recalculating something they'd assumed was settled. A father on a farming colony on the edge of human space read the headline to his daughter over breakfast, not because she'd understand the geopolitics of it, but because something in the shape of the story, the overlooked man, the 11 years, the shove that started it, felt like something worth saying out loud to a 10-year-old, even if she wouldn't remember hearing it until she was much older. "Sometimes," he told her, "the person nobody's paying attention to is the one who's been paying the most attention the whole time." She nodded, not really understanding, and went back to her cereal, and the sentence went into her the way things do at 10 years old. Not understood, just kept for later. Back on Grail Station, the Vectari delegation had not been arrested. That detail, more than any other, was what confused Thal Corvexis Wren most in the hours after the freeze. There had been no armed escort to his door, no formal charge, no dramatic seizure of the cutter. Halverson's office had simply, quietly, made it clear through the appropriate channels that the delegation's onward journey would require reclearance through consortium customs, a process that would take, at current backlog, approximately 6 weeks, during which time the cutter would remain docked, and during which time 11 separate jurisdictions would be conducting a leisurely, thorough, entirely legal audit of every subledger the delegation's trade ministry had ever touched. It was not a punishment, it was worse than a punishment. It was a demonstration that punishment had never been necessary, because the outcome had already been decided the moment Thal Corvexis Wren walked into a corridor on Deck 9 and gave an unremarkable man a reason to stop being unremarkable. Thal requested a meeting. It was granted, not by Halverson, and not by any of the credentialed diplomats who had spent 3 days negotiating an ore concession that no longer mattered to anyone. It was granted by Elias. The room they met in was small, windowless, the kind of room stations always have a few of, and nobody remembers the purpose of. Elias was in the same gray coverall. He had not changed it. He sat across a plain table with his hands flat in front of him, the posture Thal now recognized, too late, as the tell of a man who had absorbed 1,000 dismissals and never once let them surface. Thal, for his part, had lost some of the polish. His collar was straight, his posture was correct, But his voice, when it came, had none of the ceremony it had carried in the corridor. "I do not understand," he said. "What you are, your file, what little of it exists, describes a maintenance contractor, nothing more." "That's right," Elias said. "That cannot be all you are." Elias considered this for a moment, in the unhurried way he considered most things. "It's what I chose to be," he said. "For 11 years. It's not nothing." Thal absorbed that. It seemed to cost him something to absorb it, the way ideas cost something to a mind built to categorize the universe by height and title and ceremony, encountering for the first time a category it had no shelf for. "You could have stopped me in the corridor," Thal said, before any of it. "You had 11 years of leverage sitting behind that mop. You could have simply told me who you were and I would have—" "You wouldn't have believed me," Elias said. "Not really. Not until you felt it." Thal was quiet for a long moment. "Was it necessary," he said finally, "that I be the one made an example of, personally?" Elias's expression did not change, but something in his voice when he answered carried the faint weight of a man choosing his words with unusual care. "No," he said, "it wasn't personal. You gave a reason. Someone always does, eventually. It happened to be you." "That is a very cold thing to say to a man whose career you have ended." "I know," Elias said. "I'm sorry it's you. I'm not sorry it happened." Thal Corvexis. Ren looked at him for a long moment. Really looked, the way he had failed to look in the corridor, when looking would have cost him nothing, and told him everything. "What would you have done," he said slowly, "if I had simply apologized? In the corridor. If I had said the space was fine and walked on?" Elias's mouth did something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "Kept mopping," he said. "That's all I was ever doing there. The rest only happens if somebody makes it happen." It was, Thal would think later, on the long transit home with a career in ruins and an audit trail 11 jurisdictions deep behind him, the single most unsettling thing anyone had ever said to him. Not a threat, not a boast, a simple accounting of the truth, that the war, if it could be called that, had never been inevitable. It had been available, sitting quiet and unclaimed in a maintenance corridor, waiting for someone with enough arrogance to reach for it. He had reached for it himself, with his own hand, over a wet floor and 8 meters of empty space he hadn't needed at all. The formal statement came 4 days later, not from Thal's government, which was still in the early, chaotic stages of trying to determine how much of its trade ministry needed to be quietly replaced, but from the human side, a joint release from the Directorate and the Consortium Administration overseeing Grail Station, drafted with input, unusually, from Elias himself, who had never in 11 years given a statement about anything and insisted when asked on writing his own. It was broadcast station-wide and picked up within hours by outlets far beyond Grail's docking rings. Elias did not deliver it standing at a podium. He delivered it seated, in the same small, windowless room, in the same gray coverall, because Halverson had offered him a dress uniform from some archived Directorate stock, and he had declined it without much comment. "My name is Elias Voss," he said, to a camera that had clearly made him uncomfortable in a way no shove ever had. "I've cleaned the floors on Deck 9 for 11 years. Some of you have walked past me. Most of you never noticed me at all, and that was the point. And I don't say that to be clever. It was just the job. I'm not going to stand here and tell you this was a triumph. 11 people work for a shipping company that no longer exists because of what happened this week. A young officer 2 jumps from here spent his morning staring at a canceled manifest, trying to understand what happened to the life he thought he had. None of that is something to celebrate. It's just what happens when patience finally gets spent. I want to say one thing plainly, because I think it matters more than the rest of this. Nobody on this station was ever in danger from the ore concession. Nobody was ever going to be harmed by a trade agreement. What was hidden underneath it, the isotopes, the staging fleet, that was the danger, and it had been building for longer than most of you have worked here. I didn't stop a war today. I ended a very quiet preparation for one before it finished being quiet. I'm not owed anything for this. I'd like to go back to cleaning the floors, if that's all right with everyone. It's good work. Somebody has to keep this place clean, and I've gotten fairly good at it. He paused and looked, for just a moment, directly into the camera rather than past it. If you've ever walked past someone and decided they didn't matter enough to notice, I'd ask you to think about why you decided that. Not because of me, because it's usually wrong, and it's a strange thing to build a life around being wrong about. That was the entire statement, 90 seconds. No triumphant music underneath it, no dramatic staging, nothing that asked to be remembered as historic, even as it plainly was. It was, station analysts would later agree, exactly the right length, exactly the right tone, and precisely nothing like what anyone had expected a man capable of what he'd done to sound like. The response, when it came first from the edges. Not from governments, not from consortium boards, but from small human places that had no formal standing to respond at all. An elderly Vectari maintenance worker, a woman named Osa Ketveln, who had spent 40 years cleaning corridors on a Vectari transport hub and had watched the broadcast with her hands still smelling of solvent, sat for a long time afterward in her small quarters before doing something she had not done in longer than she could easily remember. She took a small carved stone from a shelf, a worn thing, smooth by handling, a piece of ritual her grandmother had taught her and that most of her generation considered old-fashioned, and set it on her windowsill facing outward toward the docking bay, a gesture that in her family's old tradition meant simple, unspoken respect for someone who had done difficult, unglamorous work well. She did not know Elias Voss. She never would. But she understood, in a way her government's trade ministry did not yet seem to, exactly what 11 years of mopped floors had actually meant, because she had lived a version of it herself. "Good," she said quietly, to no one, setting the stone in place. "Good for him." On Grail Station itself, the shift came slower and smaller, the way real change in a place usually does. Not a parade, not a ceremony, just small adjustments in 1,000 ordinary interactions. Crew members who had walked past Elias for years without a second glance began, without quite articulating why, to say good morning to him when they passed. He said it back, briefly, and kept mopping. Priya Okonkwo Reyes, the logistics clerk who had made the first call, found him on Deck 9 2 weeks later, working the same corner by Viewport 7, where it had all started, and stood for a moment without quite knowing what to say. "I don't know what to call you," she admitted finally. "Colonel? Sir? I don't even know your actual rank." Elias glanced up, considered the question with the same unhurried patience he gave everything. "Elias is fine," he said. "It's what I've gone by. 11 years is a long time to answer to something else." She nodded, and after a moment, because it seemed to matter to say, added, "Thank you for the call I made mattering. I wasn't sure it would." "It mattered," Elias said. "It always would have. That's not because of anything special about you calling it in. It's because somebody paying attention always matters, even when nothing comes of it for a long time." She turned to go, then stopped. "Were you scared?" she asked. "When he shoved you?" Elias thought about that longer than he'd thought about anything else she'd asked. "No," he said. "Mostly I was tired. 11 years is a long time to wait for one bad afternoon." The audit into the Vectari Trade Ministry's Shell Consortium network took the better part of 6 months to fully unwind, longer than anyone had initially projected, because the ministry's own record-keeping turned out to be more tangled than even Elias's decade of quiet observation had suggested. It reshaped diplomatic relations across 3 trade lanes, ended several careers that deserved ending, and a few that arguably didn't, and led eventually to a renegotiated framework for consortium oversight that closed the exact kind of loophole the isotope shipment had exploited. None of that made for dramatic footage. It was closed-door work, committee work, the slow, unglamorous business of institutions rebuilding trust in each other, one clause at a time. Nobody made a broadcast about the 14th revision of a customs inspection protocol, but it was, in its way, the actual substance of what the 11 years and the 4 seconds and the 90-second broadcast had bought. Not a single dramatic ending, but a slow, ongoing correction, still incomplete, still imperfect, still being built one committee session at a time by people who would mostly never be thanked for it. Ashworth Kim, retired now, living on a quiet stretch of coastline on a colony world with a garden she tended with more patience than most gardeners bothered to have, received a single encrypted message roughly a month after the broadcast. It contained no text, just an image, a photograph taken from a low angle of a mop and cart standing against a blue-gray tiled wall, the tile worn pale by 11 years of boots. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went out to her garden, knelt in the dirt with hands that had once signed authorization documents in rooms with no windows, and kept working, because that too was a kind of patience, and she had never really stopped believing in it. Thal Corvexus Wren did not return to diplomatic service. His government, in the aftermath of the audit, quietly reassigned him to a research liaison post on a world with considerably less prestige and considerably fewer ceremonial collars. And he took the posting without protest, which surprised the people who had known him longest. He kept, in a drawer in his new and much smaller office, a single object, a photograph he had taken himself on his personal device in the moment after the shove, before he understood what it would cost him. It showed a spilled cart, gray water fanning across pale tile, and a man in a gray coverall bending to right it without any particular urgency. He had meant, at the time, to keep it as evidence of an insignificant confrontation, something to mention at dinner as a small, dismissible anecdote about an overlooked worker who had briefly, absurdly, refused an instruction. He kept it now for a different reason, one he did not fully explain even to himself, except in the quiet moments when he took it out and looked at it, and felt something that was not quite shame and not quite gratitude, but lived somewhere close to both. Years from any dramatic accounting of it, Grail Station would still be there, its 41 docking rings a little more crowded, its trade lanes a little more carefully audited, its Deck 9 corridor tile replaced at some point during a routine refit, the old worn blue-gray pulled up and swapped for something newer that had not yet learned the shape of 11 years of boots. Elias Voss would still be there too, most days, moving through the station the way water moves through a pipe that has carried the same water for a long time. Younger crew, arriving on new postings, would sometimes hear the story secondhand, embellished a little more with each telling, and would look for him expecting someone taller, more severe, someone who carried the weight of what he'd done visibly on his shoulders. They would find instead a man in a gray coverall, pushing a cart down a quiet corridor, who nodded to them once and went back to work. On a particular evening, some years on from the shove that started all of it, Elias sat on the edge of his bunk with the framed photograph in his hands, the woman, the boy, the house that did not exist anymore, turning it over once, the way he sometimes did, though he never explained to anyone what it meant to him, and no one on the station ever asked, because by then, everyone had learned that some things about him were simply his, and would stay that way. He thought briefly about the corridor, about 8 meters of empty space that hadn't needed to matter at all, about a voice that had said, "Move your equipment," and a hand that had come down on a mop handle, expecting the world to bend the way it always had. He thought about how small the whole thing had looked, in the moment. A shove, a spilled bucket, 4 flat words, and how it had turned out to be the only 4 seconds out of 11 years of quiet mornings that anyone would remember. He set the photograph back on the shelf, exactly where it had always sat. Outside in the corridor, the station hummed its same low, unbothered hum. The sound of 6 atmospheres blended into one. The sound of 41 docking rings holding steady against the dark. The sound, if one listened long enough, of a great many ordinary people doing quiet, unremarkable things that nobody was watching. Elias listened to it for a while, the way he always did before sleep. Then he turned off the light, and in the morning, he went back to mopping the floor.